The Acolyte has now finished its, well, possibly first season.
Hmm.
Episode 8 of The Acolyte aired last night, the finale. We are going to talk about this, though, with spoilers. So here's your warning right now. If you haven't finished The Acolyte yet, or if you haven't watched The Acolyte at all, we would invite you to go check that out first before you listen to or watch this review. So, with that, let's dig into episode 8. Bobby, what did you think?
Uh, I thought that again. It's weird. And this is not the only thing that I've had this issue with. As I just mentioned with Long Legs, I started off good and then it kind of finished a little flat for me. And that's what I would say with this as well. This episode, it started off good, and right around the time that, and we are talking spoilers, so you've been
Yeah.
warned. Right around the time that Soul gets killed is when it all started to go downhill for me with the episode, because everything up to that was like, okay, this is cool, this is interesting. There's some action pieces that are just fantastic between Soul and the stranger, and then after that point, and it gets more into the story aspect of it, it just was not working right, and especially with the sadly, I hate to say it too, but with the main stars, quote unquote stars, Osha and May, that story, I think it just was not fulfilling. I think that every time within this episode it switched perspective to them, I just did not want to really feel like I was engaging in that. I just wanted to get back to other stuff. Even the stuff with Vanessa Rowe, I was trying to like get more of because that seemed more interesting than the stuff going on with the twins. So yeah, that's disappointing. And then of course a lot of that after Soul dies has to deal with the twins and stuff. So that's why I think I kind of just feel like it didn't stick the landing for me. But so much of the other stuff before that was going on worked a lot better for me than the latter half of the show. What do you think?
Not much of a fan of this. um, yeah, it didn't really work for me. Um, I mean, to backtrack a little bit, kind of like what you said about the episode is the way I look at the season.
Mm,
I think I still stand by that. I think this show had a good start. Those first 2 episodes overall, I enjoyed, and I thought it set a promising stage for the rest of the season. They weren't fantastic, but I liked them. And then, the season has been rocky kind of ever since, I guess. Well, I say that, and actually, episode 3 was probably even better in a lot of ways for as divisive as episode 3 was. Episode 3, I thought was quite good.
mm,
And then from there, it was very rocky. Episode 4 was not good. 5, I really enjoyed the fighting. But then 6 and 7, like I really did not enjoy episode 7 much at all.
mm.
Yeah, I don't know. This finale was okay, but then the funny thing is I was looking forward to going back to seeing the stranger because I was really enjoying that character. Especially like in episode 6, his dynamic with Osha was working for me. And I thought he was one of the most interesting characters so far in the show. And then even in this finale, I don't know if it's just a matter of the writing or what it was, but something seemed different about him in a way that I'm like, oh,
Mm.
I'm not even enjoying him as much in this. Um, and then yeah, I guess yeah, we are talking spoilers, but yeah, the very ending of the episode and the kind of like I don't know. There's so much, but I guess I won't get into details yet. But yeah, overall, I just didn't care for it, and it makes me kind of look at the whole season and go, okay, that was what it was. Is kind of where I am. It's one of those situations where for all the people I saw like scrolling through social media today who love the Acolyte, this is not a situation where I go, man, you guys are crazy. Why do you like this? Like, I'm like, that's fine. That's cool. Like, I don't take that away from you.
Mm.
And I'm super glad for those of you who loved it that you guys love it. Um, I just didn't enjoy certain aspects of this and certain decisions that were made by characters, especially in episode 7. That still just, the more I think about it, the more I'm not a fan of certain motivations. And yeah, in episode 8, I wasn't thrilled with it. Some cameos were fun, but
Mm.
like even that has me somewhat scratching my head. But
So I guess if you were to get into some of the details of what was disappointing about this episode, what could you mostly point to in terms of like what? Let's start with motivations. Like, what was there that you really didn't care for?
I mean, it's hard to not just answer that question focused solely on episode 8, but it's almost, now that this is the finale, it kind of like is now the way I look back at the whole season is like first is the character of Soul
Mm-hmm.
is just kind of, I don't know. There's just not enough there when it comes to his relationship, especially with Osha. I think this finale and the whole season seems like it would have worked better if we had seen actually like a lot more background with those two as like a master and apprentice, and seen more of their relationship for some of this stuff to be more powerful, especially her killing him. It just for me felt like something that would have landed and been a much more powerful moment if, as an audience, we had spent a lot more time with these two, especially back when they were actually like master and Padawan. And I'm not saying they should have found a way to fit all that into this season. I just mean in general, even if it had been over the course of 2 seasons or something, I don't know. But it was a moment that felt like it was trying to evoke a reaction that I didn't really have given what we'd been given. And then, I mean, there's just stuff about Soul through the course of the season that there's not enough there. Like his reasonings for like, having this connection to Osha. This, I'm mostly referring to stuff in episode 7 now, I guess.
Mm.
And then that kind of just flows into the stuff we see in this episode that just, I don't know. I'm like, there's just not enough there. Yeah, it's that. I guess that's like when it comes to motivations, it's probably the main thing. I mean, but also there's stuff like here at the end of this episode with the stranger. I guess we'll just keep referring to him as the stranger.
Yeah. Or Chimera.
And Osha, that is, I don't know, like immediately seeming to point toward like something more than just a master and apprentice or master and acolyte kind of situation.
Sure.
And it's like, where is this coming from? Like, there was nothing in episode 6, I guess, to really already have me going, yeah, him holding her hand at the end makes like any kind of sense.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I mean, that's kind of a nitpicky thing, I guess. But like that moment at the very end of the episode was just awkward to me. Like she's holding the lightsaber, I think, in that hand at the same time. And then like he holds her hand. I don't know. It's just weird. I'm like, why are we doing this? I don't know. Am I crazy?
No, you're not crazy. I mean, I saw the same thing as you, and I don't think I had necessarily the same reaction, other than I felt like it did seem more or less awkward in the way that it was presented. Because as much as we get from episode 6 is just that she's seeing him naked, and
Right.
it's about as much sexual
Right.
tension I guess you get from the entirety of their relationship outside of anything else that they've talked about or done. So, he mentions certain things to her in that respect of like, oh, you can do what your desires are, or something to that effect of being able to. And he says it sort of seductively in a way that it's kind of like, well, oh, you can do other things that you can't necessarily do if you're a Jedi and all this stuff. So I mean, it's all thin, and I think that
Yeah.
a lot of times that one of the problems with the show is that they try to use a shorthand a lot of times for things that needed more time to be fully developed, and we don't get that. So it makes it easy to just kind of dismiss a lot of the things that they're doing, especially when it comes to character motivations, because there's it just doesn't seem to line up with what we've been seeing. One instance in this episode in particular is just the way that throughout this entire series, we know that from May's point of view, she knows that Soul killed her mom, one of her moms. So you would think that at this point, now that she's got him and she's been wanting him to admit it, even though I don't understand that, because if she was on the ship and last week's episode was a flashback, you would think that, or it wasn't flashback, but you would think that he was telling her what happened. Then she already knows that he killed her, her mom. So I don't quite understand why she needed him to say it again. But even still, with that, it just seems weird that now her motivation would be to make him go in front of the council and admit what he's done, as opposed to just killing him. I don't know. It just seemed like another one of the examples of a quick motivation turn, almost just because the story dictates that it needs to be there, as opposed to it feeling like an organic decision that's being made there.
Right.
So there's a lot of times that the show does that, and it just kind of piles up because of these things. And then I think that it just confuses people a lot of times because of what they're doing with the story, that sometimes there's cool elements, and then there's other times where you're just scratching your head, is like, what's going on? Why is this happening? I remember even thinking that when, just in the sort of beginning of the episode, when they're on the ship and Soul is chasing after May as she's escaped, and Soul looks like he has her about to shoot off like one of the wings, or maybe clipper or something. And then Basil comes in and removes something that throws the ship into a tailspin. I'm like, why did he do that? Like, and wouldn't that make it worse? Because now you're out of control. So, like, I don't understand why he did that. And there's no explanation. There's no anything. Nope. And so you're just kind of like scratching your head, like, what was that about? There's nothing there. So it's like, how does anyone not see that as a writer or anything, that they're saying, this seems odd. How do we explain this to the audience, why this character is all of a sudden doing this? Like, it's just weird. It's just weird because he knew that was May, because he was fighting her in the last episode or whatever. So it's like, what's he doing? I don't get it. I don't get it.
That's I forgot. I even forgot about that moment because it was super awkward and odd. I'm like, I don't talk out loud when I watch things, and I think I even might have said something out loud. I'm like, what? Like, I think I had some type of reaction like that. Like, it was just so odd for all the reasons you just said.
Yeah.
I mean, I have to imagine a writer would say, well, like, Basil saw that maybe that it's not the right thing to do as a Jedi, what he was about to do or something, and was stopping him for his own good, maybe. But that there's nothing about what happens in the episode that really gives you that.
No.
Super even odd. I totally agree.
Even if he was to, all they had to do is throw in a quick 3-second scene prior to that of Soul knowing that Basil's there, and Basil sort of shaking his head and saying, like, no, don't, because he sees him approaching. He's like, no. And then that would be like enough to be able to say, oh, okay, he doesn't want him to kill, May or shoot down May. So then he ends up having to take the thing. But there's nothing there to give you any indication of why he's doing what he's doing. So it just comes off as very weird.
Yep. Totally agree.
And one of the things I feel like the biggest problem of the show is I can forgive a lot, and I can see the problems with it and still forgive it if they're doing a lot of things right. One of the things that I felt like was maybe a cardinal sin of the show as a whole was thinking that you're going to get a second season if you don't know that you're going to get a second season.
Yep.
You should not be setting things up when you
Right.
don't know that you'll be able to pay them off. And they do a lot of that. And not just within this last episode, but there's things that I'm left wondering about that have no explanation within this episode at all. Like, the one mother that disappears into smoke. Well, is she dead or did she
Right.
disappear and go somewhere? I don't know. They don't tell me. They don't even set it up to seem like it's going to be something for this next season. So it's just you're just left wondering.
Yeah.
And then the fact that we had the Kylo Ren theme playing for Chimera, it's like,
Yep.
well, what's that about? I don't know.
Yeah.
Will we ever?
Will we ever know?
Yeah. So it's like, okay, those things I just don't get, like where you didn't tie enough of these things off or at least explain it enough to leave enough of something to go into a second season. They're just left as dangling threads that have no answer whatsoever. At least where we have the appearance of Darth Plagueis, that's a setup for a second season. That's like a tidbit, a little morsel to be like, okay, here's where something that's going on that most people, if you understand some of the lore of Star Wars, you know who this character is and what he represents. And we're going to get into that more in the second season. There's stuff like that. And Yoda being there at the end. There's stuff like that that's like, okay, I see how you're trying to maneuver into a second season with some of those aspects that you're introducing in this last episode, but within that, you should at least have closed off a lot of the stuff that you had introduced in this first season that they didn't do. And that's the frustrating part of it, is just they just felt like, oh yeah, we're going to get a second season. They feel you what they feel like they did to me is what a lot of shows back in the day used to do, where this was in the height to me of all those shows that came out after Lost, where they felt like, okay, we're going to have this big genre premise type show and leave it on a cliffhanger for the first season. So they got to bring us back for a second season, right? Nope, they got canceled. You know, there's so many of those sci-fi type shows that came out after Lost that only had one season, even though they set up it for multiple seasons. And you're like, well, why'd you go into it thinking that it was a guarantee that you're getting a second season? So that's one of the, I think, more frustrating parts about this whole thing.
Yep, I thought about that too. It's a good point. I mean, it's a good point too, like pointing out the various things that were brought up throughout this season, not just in this finale. And I think that you're absolutely right. Because when it comes to the finale itself, you know, in some ways, I feel like the finale, there's no doubt, is setting up like, you know, well, okay, what's next for the stranger and Osha and such. But you could also argue that it at least ends in a way where it's like, well, if we didn't get anything else, you know, you can kind of put the pieces together for yourself in a way, knowing what we know, what happens in the future Star Wars, I guess. I mean, I will say the finale itself is not as bad of a situation as like Ahsoka. Like if we found out like Ahsoka was not getting a second season, I feel like that's even worse when it comes to the finale. Like not getting a second season to that show would be like a giant, like, what the fuck. This is still a little bit of that, but not as bad. But overall, I'm with you. Like all that other stuff throughout the season, like the Kylo Ren theme and such, like you have stuff like that, as we discussed back when that happened, using that music cue as an example. Like obviously, you know, a choice made on purpose and for a reason. And if we don't get to see it through as to why you chose that music and why that theme played there, like, then what the hell? Yeah. I'm with you.
What did you think of the scene where Osha gets so angry and you see the blue kyber crystal turn red? I don't know
the
if a lot of
bleeding of the
people.
crystal.
Yes, I don't know if a lot of people are aware of that because it's not really shown in live action Star Wars.
Well, I mean, I'll say what I've said a million times, I guess, on here, that as a big Star Wars fan, I also haven't consumed a lot of the stuff outside of live action. But there are things I'm very aware of, and the whole concept of like a Sith bleeding a crystal from a Jedi's lightsaber and making it turn red, basically. I'm very aware of that.
Mm.
Obviously we've never seen it in live action, but I knew what was happening as we were seeing it.
Hmm.
I I will say, as a Star Wars fan, it is one of those things that, as I've learned about that concept at first, anyway, I guess I've just kind of come to accept that that's canon and that's how it works. But I
Mm.
remember when I first heard that whole thing, I'm like, that seems kind of cheesy. Like this whole like a Sith has to bleed a crystal and pour all his hate and everything into it to make it turn red. I don't know. There was always something about that concept in general that I just kind of thought was a little weird, and
Mm.
I didn't. I guess I just never really knew what I thought of it. But seeing it in practice here, seeing it in live action, actually depicted, it
Hmm.
was fine. I think if I'm gonna get nitpicky, the one thing about it that was like a touch of just I don't know, that I don't know if I cared for was the actual like seeing the blade like
Oh,
slowly
sure.
change.
Okay. Hmm.
It's almost to me like the crystal changes and then the blade just kind of changes. Like not this whole like it eases up the blade. I'm being super nitpicky here. I
Mm.
get it, but I mean, it's something I thought about as well. I was watching it, going, I know this is all fake and it's all fantasy and
Hmm.
everything, but I'm like, would it really do it that way? I
Yeah.
don't know. You know?
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think is obviously a visual aspect, and
Yeah,
I know it's been depicted in comics and other aspects as well. So I don't know how they done it, and maybe it does do that where it kind of fades in or kind of distorts at first and then goes to full red. But I think within the concept alone, I just sort of accepted it from the gate where it was like, okay, the reason why there's a such thing as red lightsabers is because the crystal bleeds based on, like you said, the anger and rage of someone that goes to the dark side, and
mm-hmm.
that's why it looks that way. So I was like, okay, if there has to be a reason, then I'll accept that reasoning. And to see it depicted in live action, I thought it at least looked pretty cool. So there was that to me that I was like, okay, yeah, that's something that we haven't seen before, and they're that's one thing that I do appreciate about this show is that they've been giving us things we've never seen before in
Right.
live action and adding more to
Totally.
lore and stuff like that. So I do appreciate those aspects of it. And along those lines, not only just some of the fight choreography and the way that Soul and Stranger fight went down, which was really awesome looking to me, and some of the things that they were doing with the force and stuff, but even an earlier scene when May escapes from Soul and they're in space and they're flying through that asteroid field, I thought that looked pretty good
I
too. There was a
agree.
lot of that.
Yeah,
I was like, wow, this looks awesome.
exactly.
So it made me think too about when I was looking at that and seeing how well that was done, and that there was, before this show, there had been a lot of talk in terms of not just on Star Wars, but also Marvel, how much there was a reliance on the volume and how it looks, it just makes things look smaller in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And they were complaining, like, oh, go back to live, real locations and stuff like that. And to its credit, I will say that this show was on location a lot of times in different places, and so it had that visual look of being in a different place. But I think that that's not the only thing that's going to make a show good. It's just it not being on the volume. There,
Right.
you definitely need more than just being on location to make it feel more Star Wars like, and also have to be able to tell a good story as well as being able to have characters that people really can, I think, attach themselves to. And I think that might be one of the things that's really kind of missing from this show as well, is that you have a character like Soul, but then it's like the more you learn about him, the more you feel a little more detached from the character. All the way up into the point to where, like you sort of mentioned, that when that scene where he gets killed by OSHA, you don't really feel the impact of it as much because there hasn't been that much development between the two of those characters and their time spent together. So I think that that's kind of to the detriment of the show, that you don't really feel like you're connecting to anybody. You're just sort of watching this as an observer, and it's like you don't necessarily. That doesn't lend itself to good enjoyment of something if you feel like you're that detached and you're just kind of watching it, as opposed to feeling like you're siding with characters and going along with their journey. And I think that's the problem in and of itself, because even within a second season, I don't know that there'd be any character I'm rooting for, quote unquote, rooting for in that way, because there's, you got, even in the Jedi side with Venestra, she's obviously not on the up and up in terms of some of the things that she's done and said. And we don't still know the full extent of the relationship she has with the stranger Chimera and what's gone on there, other than it was a pupil of hers that's gone bad. And people have speculated based on seeing him without his shirt, the markings he had on his back could have been from a whip. And so there's that aspect of them saying, okay, well, that probably is Venestra and there's something there. And he says, something to the effect of, like, I think he had got that from his master or something. I can't remember what he says. He may not say his master, but something. And so we don't know, because that's one side of the story. So there's more to that story, obviously, and we just may not ever get it. But I think what I would like to see, if we don't get a second season, if they just turn this into a comic book series, a mini series, I'd pick it up just to see where they go with it and be able to finish the story out. Because there's some compelling and intriguing things that they introduce in it that would make me want to watch it, but not as live action necessarily. Because not unless they drastically do something different in the writer's room for me to really feel like it would be worth them taking the time and effort to make a second season of this show, especially based on how poorly it's been received. While I think that I'm not as hard on it as most people have been, I still see that it's not where I felt like I wanted it to be when I first heard about the announcement of the show.
Absolutely. To the idea of like them continuing it in another medium, like comic books or something, I'm with you. If this show does not get a second season, I would totally hope that at least they would do something like that, so that we could see where they would maybe, go from here. The only reason I could see them not doing that is if, I would like to think that if indeed the show is the idea generally is that the show would go down a path of including more of how Darth Plagueis plays into this and his story. I would like to think that even if they chose not to do a second season of The Acolyte, they would hold on to the idea of depicting stuff about Darth Plagueis in live action at some point in another way. That's just such an important story in Star Wars lore. And I mean, we're both familiar with the book that is now a Legends book. That's quite good. And not to say that they should, obviously, what's the word I'm trying to think of? But anyway, depict that book specifically, but I maybe pull some things from it. I would hope that maybe at least they would do something in another form if they don't continue with this. I was gonna say, you mentioned Vanessa Rowe. I hadn't talked about her yet. Yeah, still overall not a fan
Mm,
of that character. I don't know if it's just the writing of the character and or the acting of the character or what.
yeah.
But it also reminds me of just the general choices of Jedi in this. And I want to be clear
Mm,
with what I'm about to say. I don't think that the Jedi should only ever be depicted in a "we are great" kind of "we can do no wrong" kind of way. Like, I think it's great and fascinating anyway to see more nuance to the Jedi, and not always making the right choices. And I'm not saying I even have a problem with the Jedi being shown to cover something up necessarily, but I don't know. There was just a lot of like straight up really bad choices by Jedi in the show overall,
mm-hmm.
like to a tipping point for me of like just really stupid bad choices. And then the whole like we're covering it up thing, like the speech she gives to the some council or
Mm,
whoever they, these senators or
the
something.
Senate
I don't know.
Council.
It rubbed me the wrong way. If I'm making sense, again,
Yeah.
not trying to say that they should only be perfect people. I really am not saying that. But like going back to episode 7, some of the stuff the Jedi do, I think it would have been more interesting to depict that whole story from the Jedi perspective in a way that really made it seem like the Jedi were really thinking they were in the right. And I think that that's what they thought they were doing. Like,
Sure.
but it's still so blatantly obvious that I'm like, no, what are you doing? These are, you are making really terrible choices. Like, as an audience member, it would have been nice to see it depicted in a way where it's like, okay, yeah, I see why he would choose to do that. Like, I get it. I get why they would think they need to get in there and get these kids out of the, away from these witches or something. But no, it was not presented in that way at all.
Mm-hmm.
And in this episode with the whole cover up and just accusing, just pinning it all on Soul, and
Mm-hmm. That
I don't
sucks
know.
so bad.
It's just
It's
I hated it.
yeah. I mean, for me, it wasn't about that so much as that I feel like I don't mind the point that they arrived at. It's just how they got there, I suppose,
Right.
is what bothers me the most. And there's an element to this that I feel like all you had to do is shuffle some things around a little bit, and it would have made more of a cohesive and better, interesting story. In that the show was initially pitched to us as the idea of getting to follow the Sith and really sort of showing things from the Sith point of view. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't really feel like they fully did that. Not really. They show it in aspects, in little bits, and hearing it in conversation, but it doesn't just follow them in that way. And that, I think, in and of itself could have been just the thing that they needed to do, is just follow Chimere and his whole thing from his
Mm-hmm.
perspective is what he's doing. And the Jedi's are more of the background players in it, and that could have
Totally.
been a better thing.
I mean, I think
But
that's
if
what we
you,
both, not just you and me, but a lot of us, but I think
yeah,
that's what we were expecting, was that kind of show from their
that kind of
perspective
show.
more specifically.
Exactly. And even if you did it the way that you ended up doing it, I think had you have done it maybe with the focus of the twins being the background, the Jedi being the foreground, then the B story could have been outside of them looking into things and these twins and all that stuff, and the imposing threat of a Sith possibly. The B story could have been what's going on with Vanessa Rowe in the Senate and the inquiries that they're talking about in this episode,
Mm-hmm.
or looking into investigating the Jedi. That could build tension and also create an aspect as to why it's imperative that she's needs to cover these things up, to keep
Right.
the Jedi out there before the greater good. And this would be her house. A lot of villains are born through the fact that they think they're doing something for the greater good at the cost of what the current situation is. So yeah, I mean, I think that you just move some pieces around. You still could have had a better way of doing this story, but as it was just, I guess, ultimately just kind of messy, really.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I have nothing to really add to that. I agree.
Hmm.
Um, One thing I was going to point out too, the music in this show overall, not just this episode, but overall was, I think Michelle brought this up when we discussed the Acolyte in the past, that the music just seemed almost kind of not there. And
Hmm.
overall, I think music was used in a very subtle way. I would argue in a not very Star Wars way. I think in Star Wars, especially when we go back to the roots of John Williams in Star Wars, it's very there.
Hmm.
All the various Star Wars themes are super present, and I don't have a problem with music being used differently in a show like this. And in fact, the reason I bring it up is I feel like in these latter episodes, especially episode 6, and then in this episode, I thought music was used in actually a very good way, and I enjoyed the music quite a bit.
Hmm.
But overall, the music was just very subtle. So much so that I think in earlier episodes, it like not that you need to notice the music, and the music's not really supposed to be necessarily noticed, but really not noticed. Like almost
Yeah.
like, is there music in this show at all? Because it probably doesn't help too that the show doesn't really seem to have a theme, like a main title theme. I mean, there is kind of a
Right.
somewhat of a theme when we see the title, but
Yeah.
it's not much.
No,
Um,
there's not much there.
I'm not familiar with the composer either. Michael, I'm guessing you would say his last name is Abels, Michael Abels. It looks like some of his background is actually writing music for, I think, most, if not all, of the Jordan Peele films.
Hmm.
Nope and Get Out. But anyway, just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, I did. I would say that me. I don't always hear music when I'm watching something. It's almost always intuitively in the background for me. And
Mm,
I would say that there was only a couple times where I really kind of thought it stood out for me, but most of the time, yeah, it's not really present in any kind of way. And like you said, and sometimes when it is, it's in a non-traditional Star Warsy kind of way.
right. Well, any other thoughts on the finale of The Acolyte before we wrap up?
Just that it kind of bums me out a little bit that for most people this is their first introduction into the High Republic. And granted, this is sort of
Yeah.
supposed to be the tail end of the High Republic era, going into the what is it, the New Republic era, or I forget. There's a name for it, but um, yeah. So and that's kind of disappointing as someone who's read the books for High Republic. That it just makes me wish that they would do something that someone else has said. Christian Harloff has said this for years, and I don't know if he says it as much anymore. But they really could just adapt the books that they already have and make them live action films, and not have to worry about trying to invent things whole cloth to try and put out there, because they've got some
Totally.
great stories and they could just make them into film, and then people would be like, oh, I'm totally on board and I want to see more of this. But yeah, it feels like I don't know where we're going next in terms of with this whole Star Wars thing. Obviously we have well, not obviously because it hasn't been announced, but we feel like there very strongly that there will be an Ahsoka season 2. We know that we have Skeleton Crew coming, and then we have the Rey movie, and or at least we think we have the Rey movie, and then we have the Mandalorian movie. I'm very curious what their next step will be for Disney Plus Star Wars shows, because at this point I'd say they have more misses than hits.
Yes.
And it's and I'm sorry, we also have Andor season 2 coming. But
Yeah.
yeah, you just feel like they have to be at this point having to take a step back and look and seeing what's worth doing for a show on Disney Plus and how can we make it better. And one of those things I would implore them to think is that you have to at least make it an hour for each episode, no matter how many episodes there are in a season. You got to make those episodes at least an hour.
Don't disagree. Um, going back real quick, you mentioned that like what was the next era called? I looked it up. At least on that official like timeline that they Lucasfilm put out, I guess they just called the next era the Fall of the Jedi.
Okay, I knew it had a different sort of name to it.
And then after that, the Reign of the Empire. But anyway,
Oh, one last thing before I forget. And earlier, when I was trying to think of the names of the writers for the Avengers films, it's actually Marcus and McFeely. Those are
okay.
the writers.
No, I was gonna say I agree when it comes to like the idea of just go ahead and adapt some of the novels you've done. I totally with you. I mean, going back to the novel we already brought up, the Darth Plagueis novel. I mean, you know, if you say you didn't continue the Acolyte in the story of Plagueis and how he fits into this, I mean, I don't think there's really much about that novel that still you couldn't probably make that novel almost exactly into live action and it be canon and it totally work with what we've been given.
Yeah.
And that was a great novel. Like you could make that as a live action film. It would be fantastic.
Yeah.
Or as a really good series. That might even be better. Like, and we're talking like hour long in depth
Totally.
series. Like do it. Like, but no, I think it'd be printing money.
Yeah, they could.
I was going to say, I think you touched on this, you know, when you were talking earlier, and I didn't really get to say. I did mean to say that overall, though, in this show, if there was a standout greatness about the show, was the fight choreography.
Yeah.
Basically, every fight scene in this show, I thoroughly enjoyed. And the finale is just the same. The fighting in this finale was great throughout the show. I mean, the fight stuff we saw in the first episode really set the stage for, wow, this is going to be a great show. And at least all the fight scenes continue to be great, but even if other stuff wasn't so great. But I wanted to point that out. If anything, I wish there had been even more. But I was a little disappointed. I thought we might get another look at the lightsaber whip in this finale, and we didn't. But I guess that is what it is. It seems like the show would be setting up that Vanestro would be even more involved in a second season if we get a second season.
Yeah.
I guess that could be a good or a bad thing, given what I thought of that performance and that character in this first season. But maybe she could be redeemed for me in a second season. I don't know. But yeah, I just wanted to point those things out before we wrap up.